And I'm sorry, this is billed as a coffee break, so for those of you who are disappointed about the coffee and you have me to listen to, I'm very sorry. But I do understand that there is coffee as well, so maybe there's a way of mingling the two. So apologies for shoehorning myself into the coffee. The original speaking slot, I'm afraid, I could not do. Listen, it's a real privilege to be here in Berlin today, of all days, 30 years to the very day when the wall fell, when the confused DDR spokesperson Gunter Schabowski checked his notes in a panic when he was asked by a journalist when the wall, or certainly when the border restrictions would be restricted, and his reply was sofort, as far as he was aware, which means, of course, at once. And then thousands of people rushed to the wall, and the rest is history. And it's a beautiful and wonderful thing to be in a city that, even though I have no direct connection to, in terms of my history, the first time I came here was with my German grandmother many years after the fall of the wall. But I felt even then, as soon as I came to this city, an incredible sense of familiarity. And that's the wonderful thing about Berlin, that it doesn't matter where you're from, doesn't matter what your background is. This is a city that really does feel as if it welcomes you. It is steeped everywhere you go in history, but it is a city that is so rich and full of life. And that's something I think we should all celebrate, because I mentioned my German grandmother, and I mentioned the fact that I came here first with her. She had actually worked here in her youth. She was a secretary at the Auswärtiges Amt, the Foreign Office. She wanted to kind of little tour of what the neighborhood that she used to work in was like, down on Wilhelmstrasse, which has completely changed now, transformed beyond all recognition. I think, in fact, she was slightly disappointed that she didn't recognize any of the landmarks when she came here. But I'm very proud of the fact that she is someone who, she's no longer with us, unfortunately, but is representative, I think, of what so many of us in Europe have been through. The history, family history of so many of us is entwined in what has happened in Europe, and we are no longer able to define ourselves as coming from one part of Europe only, one particular place. We are a mix. Her family came from the east of Germany, in a part of Europe which is now in Poland. Her entire family had to flee west when the Red Army came from the east. Many of them were bombed. Many of them died and suffocated in cellars, particularly in Dresden, where many of my German family fled. And some of them ended up in Hamburg, which is where the majority of my grandmother's family ended up. And the other half of my family come from Ireland. My father's mother fled poverty in the southwest of Ireland when she was very young, and travelled, as so many of her brothers and sisters had, to England and settled in London. My German grandmother came after the war and settled in England, having met my grandfather at a displaced persons camp in Europe. So I'm very proud to be a European mongrel. I'm proud to be a citizen of the world. And it's a reflection, I think, of the developments, and I want to build on some of the themes that we've just heard in the previous speech. Identity, and what it is to be who we are and to feel who we are. There is a new group in the European Parliament called the ID, the Identity and Democracy Group, whose ethos, I think, is the antithesis of what I'm describing here today. It is an ethos that basically ascribes to you a singular identity that you must wear as a badge of honor above everything else, and that identity must trump everything else. In the case of the parties that are a part of ID, the most known perhaps here would be AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, which of course is a party that trades on the identity of being German above all others. In Britain we have the Brexit Party, who I'm sure would like to be part of the ID group, although for various machinations and reasons I won't go into here, they're not. They trade on the sense of identity. The French party that topped the polls in the European Parliament in May trade on that sense of identity. And again, one has to wonder why this is resurgent, why this is a feeling that is coming back and is more and more prevalent. And I do have to say, I think it's something to do with the passing of that generation that my grandmother was a part of. The passing of the generation for whom the war was something that was not only an important milestone in their events, but in their life spans, but something that they directly experienced, the consequences of which really only ended in 1989. I think it's fair to say the Second World War didn't end in 1945. It ended on that night in November in 1989, or if you want to be a bit more pedantic, perhaps when the DDR finally ceased to exist a few months later. And that generation had that backstory. They had the reasons. Oh, we've got the UN flag, we've got the EU flag. They had their reasons for multilateralism. They had their reasons for setting up the institutions that have preserved so much of what we hold and perhaps take for granted today. But this generation doesn't have that backstory. We have nothing around which we can coalesce, around which there is a settled consensus. And part of the problem, I feel, is that in the years after the fall of the wall, leading up to 9/11, we didn't do enough to defend the multilateralism that had been set up. We didn't do enough to imbue in the population the sense of why it is we have these institutions, a feeling of belonging and a feeling of purpose and rationale behind them. Now, in my country, in Britain, obviously the consequences of that have come to an obvious, not conclusion, but certainly the process that we're seeing with Brexit is a direct, I think, result of that. Even governments that I am proud to have played a tiny, tiny part in my previous guise as a special advisor, the Labour government before, even the Labour government didn't do enough to promote and protect and make the case for Europe. And we are now seeing the direct consequences of that. And the problem we are now operating in, of course, is that the populists do have their backstory. The AfD, the Front National, La Lega Norda, the PIS in Poland, they have, and Orban, of course, in Hungary, they have their backstory. And the backstory is set up against the context of change that we have in our society. Automation in the workplace, not just in manufacturing, but also in services as well. It's getting harder and harder to find a job that pays decently, that one can work in for an entire career. It is getting harder and harder to find good quality housing. It is harder and harder to find good quality public services. Now, none of that is because of the multilateral system that we built up after the war. None of that is because of the existence of the European Union, and none of that is because people from other cultures, with other skin colours, with other religions, with other sexualities, with other gender identities, none of that is because people are coming to cities like Berlin and Bratislava and Bilbao and Birmingham and moving in and making their home there. That is not the reason why people are facing the problems they are facing, but the populists are able, of course, to use scapegoating, that age-old, tired old tactic that Berliners know only full well. They are using that tactic to create their backstory. And their backstory is that there is an elite that doesn't understand the ordinary concerns of ordinary people, that is concentrating on esoteric topics like climate change, like liberty and equality, these things that don't really matter, do they? And we have to get real about the scale of this threat and be very, very muscular in our defense of what it means to have a multilateral system and why the tenets of liberal democracy, which are, yes, free speech, yes, the freedom of expression, and yes, the freedom of movement, but also the respect and preservation of minorities as equal citizens. That is, again, something we have to be muscular in our defense about. Why are the populists able to get such a foothold in our democracies at the moment? Obviously, it's tied in with the technological revolution that we're undergoing. It is unthinkable previously to have had the reach now to be able to go into people's individual news feeds, which are siloed because we only now talk to people we want to talk to and hear from people we want to hear from, to be able to reach people through their social media feeds and directly influence the way they feel and the way they speak. And I feel that those of us who are internationalists, those of us who defend the multilateral world order, we have to be as equally ruthless in our penetration of people's environment, of social media, and we have to be clear and robust about what it is these institutions stand for, what they do, and relate it to people. And these are the things I think we need to do. Firstly, we have to break it down and make it relatable. We have to explain in each facet of daily life what it is institutions like the European Union are capable of delivering, as well as what they're incapable of delivering, so that people have a clear idea of what it is the different institutions, the different bodies, and the relationship between different layers of government work. The second thing is it cannot just come from one set of institutions, namely the European institutions, the Commission, the Council and the Parliament. It has to come from all levels of civil society and local government. That means that the Berlin city government must do as much to defend Europe as the European Commission. And I say this, by the way, as someone who believes that the cities already are doing a lot more to defend the idea of European identity and European networks than is being seen and transmitted and related in the media. However, that relationship has to be one that is free-flowing and two-way, so that we have the big institutions at the European level in Brussels supporting local and regional government and vice versa. And I think there is an important role, incidentally, for the Committee of the Regions in Brussels to play in that, because they are the direct go-between between the European institutions in Brussels and the local layer of government. And the third thing we need to do is relate all of this to what I think is the key problem we face and the key message that people coalesce around, and that is about control. People, I feel, are feeling a sense that they are alienated from the world around them, not just because perhaps they perceive there to be an out-of-touch elite or a set of institutions they don't fully understand, but because they feel they have no control over their lives anymore. They feel that the levers of control lie elsewhere. Are they able, for example, to even have a say over their local environment? Do they feel as if they are fully participating in the democratic structures? The slogan that won it for the Brexit campaign, "Take Back Control," was one of the most powerful and intuitive slogans that I've ever seen in a political campaign. It's one, incidentally, I feel that the resurgent Remain side should be using, because that's what we have to demonstrate as committed pro-Europeans, that it is taking back control to be part of a system that amplifies your sovereignty. It is taking back control to be able to pool sovereignty in order to have more effectiveness over the decisions that affect each and everybody's individual life. And that is the key challenge that we have. How do we relate the fact that you have more control as part of a network rather than being outside of it? So that's my message to you. We have to drill it down. We have to make it personal, and we have to make it about control. And I think we can get there. I think we can win this argument, because if we leave it to the populists, we end up repeating the same mistakes of the past. The populism comes and goes. There are waves. It ebbs and flows. I have no idea what this current wave of populism will look like in a few years' time. Is it already on the way back? Perhaps there are signs that it is, but we have to mobilize citizens and we have to empower them. And I'm very confident that is something that the European Parliament, certainly in the new Parliament, is capable of doing through the energy and the initiatives that I've seen in the members that have been elected in May. I don't know how long I'm going to be there, but we'll see. Brexit's not over, so don't give up on us just yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your optimism. Any questions, please? Please.
Congratulations on a very interesting talk delivered. Congratulations on a wonderful talk delivered with extraordinary brevity, but very high on content. Can I ask you, when you say the resurgent Remain movement, that's music to my ears, as you might appreciate from my accent. But how real is that, and how likely is it to succeed?
Sure.
It would just make my day if you could keep going on that.
Yeah, you're not the only one. Look, I think what's happened is Brexit as an idea has remained popular from the outset of the referendum through to, well, I would say the present time, but sort of a few months ago, basically, as a popular idea in the general consciousness. I think Brexit has remained stubbornly, even though I and you and many others have been pointing out the logical flaws in Brexit. It hasn't really cut through. The time when it did cut through was with the first agreement of the withdrawal agreement, the first iteration of the withdrawal agreement under Theresa May, when for the first time the black and white negatives of Brexit had to be spelt out. And at that point, the House of Commons rejected it overwhelmingly because, of course, nobody wanted to take ownership of the negatives. I think what we've transferred to now is a sort of acceptance that the negatives are there, but nobody wants to kind of be seen to be responsible for them, so they try and fit themselves into camps by which they can deflect the blame. So when the Prime Minister talks about there being no checks, you know, I'm the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, there'll be no checks on the border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, don't you worry about it. He is simply trying to pass this problem down the road and try and deflect it and so on. There is now far more consciousness amongst the general British public about what the negatives of Brexit are. I am very, very confident, absolutely confident, that if the current withdrawal agreement were put to a referendum against remaining in the European Union, remaining in the European Union will win. What we have to do is ensure that Boris Johnson doesn't get a majority on the 12th of December. That's the hardest, biggest, most difficult hurdle we have to face. There are many signs that his campaign is floundering. He's certainly not the best speaker and campaigner that people thought he was. But I have to be honest here, my party's not doing very well. And that's no surprise to anyone. So frankly, it's all up for grabs. And on the 12th of December, we'll know one way or another. But I tell you this, if Johnson doesn't get his majority, I am very confident of a referendum, and I'm very confident of a Remain win. So those are the stakes. If Johnson gets his majority, I'm afraid we're heading for a very different outcome.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.